She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She didn't even say his name, because the one thing she'd been taught, over and over, was that his name was the one thing she was never allowed to say. All she did was cross a quiet corridor, get behind the biggest, stillest man in the palace, grip a fistful of his scarlet tunic like it was the only solid thing left in the world, and whisper 8 words into his back. He did it again, but I can't say who. And Sergeant Callum Reeve, 12 years of service, famous through the whole East Wing for never so much as blinking on post, understood in that 1 second that if he reported this the way he was trained to, through every proper channel, the man who'd done it would bury the truth by morning and turn it back on the child by lunch. Because the man who'd hurt her wasn't a junior nanny or a footman, he was Dr. Alistair Crane, 30 years in the household, tutor to princes, untouchable. So before we show you the moment Crane stood in that corridor and condemned himself out of his own arrogant mouth, with a furious Prince William listening from the shadows of the gallery, and before we show you what happened after, when the immovable guard who risked a court-martial to protect one little girl finally dropped to his knees on the cold stone and broke down completely. Do us one thing. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Then hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because this story isn't about a bruise on a child's arm. It's about what a good man is willing to lose to give a silenced little girl her voice back. The East Wing Junction was the quietest post in the palace, and Sergeant Callum Reeve had stood it long enough to know the difference between quiet that meant nothing and quiet that meant something was coming. This was the second kind. He didn't move. 12 years of service had trained the stillness into him until it was less a discipline than a resting state. Scarlet tunic squared, bearskin level, gloved hands loose at his sides, boots planted on the seam where the runner met the stone. From here he could see 3 approaches: the long gallery that ran back toward the staterooms, the short corridor to the private study where the children took their afternoon lessons, and the service stair that curled down toward the kitchens. Nothing moved on any of them. The light came slanting gold through the tall windows, dust turning slow in the beams, and the clock 2 rooms over ticked with the patience of something that had counted a great many afternoons and expected to count a great many more. Then the study door opened at the end of the short corridor, and Reeve heard footsteps that were wrong, not the pace of a child released from lessons. That was quick, uneven, a skip in it. This was careful. Small feet placing themselves with the deliberation of someone who had learned that noise had consequences. He didn't turn. He let the sound resolve itself, the way he'd been taught, reading it before he looked. Light, slow, stopping once, halfway, as if the person making it had reconsidered the whole idea of moving at all. He turned his head only when the footsteps came close enough that not turning would have meant she walked into him. Princess Charlotte. She was in her lesson clothes, neat as always, hair still pinned the way her mother liked it. But she was holding her right arm the way people held things that hurt, close, protected, the shoulder rolled in around it. Her chin was down. Her eyes came up to his face and then dropped again, fast, and that fast drop told him more than a full minute of talking would have. He had seen grown men look at the floor like that. Men who had been made to feel that looking up was a thing they no longer had permission to do. She didn't ask to speak to him. She didn't announce herself. She simply crossed the last few feet and put herself behind him, not beside, behind, the way you get behind a wall, so that the length of his body stood between her and the corridor she had just come down. Reeve did not crouch. He did not soften his face or make the small sympathetic sounds people made at children, because every instinct he owned told him those things would frighten her more, not less. He shifted his weight instead. A single quarter turn of his boots, enough to bring his shoulder around so that the line of him fully closed the corridor behind her. Containment, not comfort. She felt it. Her breathing changed. A small hitch, then steadier, as if the wall had done what walls are for. Her voice came at his back, low enough that it barely carried over the ticking clock. "He did it again," she whispered, "but I can't say who." Reeve didn't move. He had heard a great many sentences in 12 years. That one landed differently, because he understood immediately that both halves of it were true, that something had been done, and that she genuinely believed she was not allowed to name it. And in that understanding he recognized, exactly, the posture of a child who had been taught to be silent by someone she was not permitted to accuse. He gave her a moment before he did anything, because moving too soon would have felt, to her, like a demand. He let the silence sit, let her decide the wall was going to stay a wall. Then he spoke, quietly, without turning fully toward her, keeping his face forward, giving her the back of a shoulder to talk to, rather than the pressure of being looked at. "You don't have to say who," Reeve said. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to." The breath she let out was too big for her body. It shuddered on the way out. "I'm not lying," she whispered. "I know it sounds like I'm lying, but I'm not." "I didn't say you were lying. Everyone says I make things bigger than they are." The words came fast now, tumbling, the way they did when a child had rehearsed a defense so many times it had worn a groove. "That I'm dramatic, that I don't understand, and I take things the wrong way, and I—" She stopped, swallowed. "That's what he says. He, not a name." Reeve filed it without reaching for it. "You did not chase the name out of a child like this. You waited for it to fall. Your arm," he said instead. Gentle, flat, not a question that could be refused, but not an order either. "Will you show me?" A long pause. Then from behind him, the small sound of fabric, a sleeve being drawn back, slowly, the way you uncover a thing you are ashamed of. He turned his head, just enough, and looked down. He didn't let his face change. That was the first rule and the hardest, and he'd learned it in places a long way from any palace. You did not flinch, because a flinch told the child the thing was as bad as they feared, and then they closed like a fist and you got nothing. But it was bad. The forearm carried a band of red across the underside, not a bruise from a fall, which spread and bloomed where the ground met bone. This was linear, a grip, fingers. The skin at the edges had that faint yellow undertone that meant it wasn't the first time the same place had been held. He had seen a great deal of violence in his life, and most of it was loud and clumsy. This was neither. This was controlled. Someone who knew exactly how much force left a mark that a long sleeve would cover. "Does it hurt when you turn it?" he asked. She turned it a fraction, winced, stopped. "A little," she said, which meant a lot. "All right." He let the sleeve fall gently back over it himself, one gloved finger, so that she didn't have to. "You can put it away." She held the arm close again. And now that the worst of it was between them and named, without ever being named, something in her loosened enough to talk. "He said if I told, it would be my word." Her voice was very small, "and that nobody's word is worth more than his. He's been here longer than anyone. Everyone loves him. Papa listens to him about everything." A pause. "He said if I made him look bad, then I'd be the one who—" She couldn't finish it. She didn't have to. Reeve stood very still, and behind the stillness his mind moved fast and cold. This was not a tantrum gone wrong. It was not a lesson that had gotten physical in a moment of frustration. The bruising was old under new. The threat was practiced. And the shape of the person behind it was becoming unmistakable. Not a junior officer, not a nanny who could be quietly reassigned, but someone senior enough that a child had already, correctly, calculated that the truth would lose. He knew who took Charlotte's afternoon lessons. Everyone in the wing knew. Dr. Alistair Crane. 30 years in the household, tutor to 2 generations. Decorated, deferred to, invited to the table. The kind of man whose reputation was itself a wall, and Reeve understood, with a clarity that settled like ice, that if this went up the normal chain, it would hit that wall and come straight back down onto the girl behind him. Report it the correct way, and Crane would bury it by morning. Reeve had built his whole career on the chain of command. You reported up. You trusted that the structure above you was sound, that it would take what you handed it and do the right thing with it. That trust was the spine of everything he wore on his back, the tunic, the rank, the post itself. And standing there with a bruised 9-year-old pressed to his spine, he understood that the structure was exactly the problem. If he keyed his radio and reported an allegation against Dr. Alistair Crane, the report would go where reports went, up into the household hierarchy, into offices where Crane had spent 30 years making himself indispensable. It would be handled, discreetly. A word would be had. Crane would be given the courtesy of the benefit of the doubt that his decades bought him, and he would use that courtesy and the interval it created to do exactly what he'd already trained Charlotte to expect, turn it into her word against his. The dramatic child, the devoted tutor, Reeve had watched lesser men than Crane survive worse on reputation alone. By the time anyone with real authority looked at that arm, Crane would have an explanation ready, and Charlotte would have been made to doubt herself so thoroughly that she'd half agree to it. The truth had a window, and the window was now, and it would not open twice. So Reeve made the calculation that would, if he was wrong, end him. He would not report it up the compromised chain. He would not hand this to the machine that Crane had spent a lifetime learning to work. He would keep the truth in the one place it couldn't be edited, this corridor, this moment, in front of the only authority in the building that Crane's reputation could not bend. And that authority was, right now, moving toward him. He knew the movements. It was his job to know them. Prince William was due through the east wing within the quarter hour, a brief, routine passage from the state rooms back toward the family apartments. The kind of thing Reeve logged without thinking every single day. 15 minutes, give or take. If he could hold this corridor, if he could keep Charlotte here and Crane here and let nothing leave and nothing be reported, until that passage brought the one man Crane could not talk his way past straight into the middle of it, then the truth would surface where it could not be buried. It was, put plainly, insubordination. He would be delaying and manipulating the movement of senior figures without authorization, on nothing but his own judgment. If he had read the arm wrong, if there was some explanation he couldn't see, he would have staked 12 years and every ribbon on it and lost. Court-martial was not too strong a word. He looked at none of that for very long. He'd made harder calls with worse odds and less at stake than a child. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I need you to do something for me. And I need you to trust me, even though I can't explain all of it yet." Behind him, she went still. "I'm not going to send this up to the offices," he said. "Do you understand what I mean when I say that?" A small silence. Then, carefully, "You're not going to tell. I'm going to make sure the right person hears it from the right place," he said. "Not on paper. Not where it can be made smaller. I need you to stay exactly where you are, behind me. And I need you not to be afraid of what I do next, even if it looks strange. Can you do that?" He felt, rather than saw, her nod against the back of his tunic. "Good girl," he said. And then, down the short corridor, the study door opened again, and a measured, unhurried set of footsteps started toward them. Dr. Crane had come looking for her. Dr. Alistair Crane came down the corridor the way he came into every room he had ever entered, as though it had been waiting for him. He was a tall man gone comfortable with age, silver at the temples, dressed with the quiet expense of someone who had never once had to prove he belonged. He carried a slim leather folio under one arm. His expression was mild, almost warm, the expression of a man expecting a small, easily managed inconvenience. He did not look like a man in any trouble at all, and Reeve understood that this was precisely the weapon. The man had been believed for so long that being believed had become his natural resting face. "There you are," Crane said, and his eyes went past Reeve to the small shape half hidden behind him. His voice was gentle, reasonable, pitched for anyone who might be listening. "Charlotte, we don't run off in the middle of a lesson. Come along now. You've upset yourself over nothing again." Charlotte didn't move. Reeve felt her fingers tighten on the back of his tunic. "Sir," Reeve said, "level, neutral. The princess is staying here for the moment." Crane's gaze shifted to him properly for the first time, and something recalibrated behind the mild eyes. A man reclassifying an object he had assumed was furniture and found to be, unexpectedly, in his way. "I'm sorry," Crane said pleasantly. "Staying here. On whose instruction?" "Mine, sir." A small, indulgent laugh. "Sergeant, I appreciate that you take your duties seriously. but I've had the care of this child's education for some years, and I think I can be trusted to know when she's overtired and when she needs to be walked back to her desk." He extended a hand, palm up, toward Charlotte, without stepping closer. "Come along, dear. This is embarrassing for everyone." "She's staying here," Reeve said again, same tone. He did not raise his voice a single degree, because he had learned long ago that the man who stays quiet in an argument is the man who is winning it, and he wanted Crane to hear that steadiness and be unsettled by it. The pleasantness thinned, just slightly, at the edges. "You're a guard," Crane said. "Do you understand what that means? It means you stand. It means you are, with respect, a piece of the architecture. It does not mean you interpose yourself between a member of this household and a child in that member's charge." He let that settle, then softened again, the practiced pivot of a man who had talked his way out of a great many corners. "I don't want to make trouble for you. Truly. Step aside. Let me take Charlotte to finish her lesson, and we'll all forget this happened. We'll all forget this happened." Reeve marked the phrase. Men who had nothing to hide did not offer, unprompted, to help you forget things. "With respect, Doctor," Reeve said, "the princess came to me. She's holding her arm. I'd rather she stayed where she is until I'm satisfied she's all right." For the first time, something moved in Crane's face that wasn't performance. A flicker, fast and gone. His eyes went to Charlotte's arm, the way she was cradling it, and Reeve watched the man register exactly what the guard had already seen, and understand that the guard had seen it too. "Her arm," Crane repeated. The warmth came back, but it came back a half-second too late, and it came back too smooth. She caught it on the edge of the desk earlier. Clumsy girl, she was reaching for a book she'd been told to leave. "I told her to be careful." He shook his head, fond, sorrowful. "She bruises terribly, always has. Ask her mother. It looks far worse than it is. She bruises terribly. It looks worse than it is." The exact sentence a frightened child had used 10 minutes ago, standing behind him. Crane had put it in her mouth so many times it had become hers. Reeve said nothing. He simply held his ground and let the silence do to Crane what silence did to men who needed to keep talking. And Crane, who had never in 30 years had to stand in a quiet he didn't control, kept talking. Sergeant, cooler now. The reasonable man mask, slipping towards something harder underneath. "I am going to walk this child to her desk. If you obstruct me, I will be having a conversation with people considerably above your pay grade before the hour is out, and I promise you, that conversation will not go the way you imagine." He stepped forward. "Now move." Reeve did not move. Crane stopped short, because a man in scarlet who does not move is a surprisingly total thing to encounter, and for a moment the corridor held nothing but the clock, 2 rooms away, and the tutor's breath going slightly uneven with the unfamiliar sensation of not being obeyed. Reeve let it stretch. Then he did the thing he had decided to do, the only weapon he had that wasn't force. He stopped defending and started inviting. "You said she caught it on the desk," Reeve said, mild, almost conversational, as if they were sorting out a scheduling error. "Reaching for a book she'd been told to leave." "That's right." Crane seized it, relieved to be back on the ground of explanation, where he had always been unbeatable. "She doesn't listen. I've raised it with her parents more than once. The willfulness. You give her a simple instruction and she does the opposite, and then she's surprised when there are consequences." "Consequences," Reeve repeated, gently, the way you'd turn a stone over to see what was under it. "Discipline, Sergeant, the unfashionable word for it. This child has been indulged her entire life, and someone has to hold a line, and I have held that line for this family for 30 years, while everyone else was busy being charming at her." A note of old grievance came up in his voice, and he didn't notice its surface. "You cannot teach a child anything if she believes there's no price for defiance. She has to understand that when I tell her to stop, she stops. When I take hold of her, he caught it, a beat too late. She understands she's to stand still," he finished, smoothing it over. But the smoothing was audible, and both of them heard it. Reeve kept his face still and his voice easy, and pushed once more, softly, into the gap the man had just opened. "When you take hold of her," he said. Not a question, an echo. Handing the sentence back to Crane so he'd feel obliged to complete it, the way a man does when he thinks he's still explaining himself to someone beneath him. And Crane, arrogant, certain, 30 years unchallenged, incapable of imagining that a piece of the architecture could be laying anything for him, took it. "Yes, when I take hold of her arm to correct her posture, and she wrenches away like I'm hurting her." His voice rose, righteous, the grievance fully out now. "That's how she does it. She pulls, she makes it dramatic, and she leaves the mark on herself, and then looks at me as though I've done something. This morning was no different. I held her arm, she fought me over a book, and if there's a bruise then she made it herself, twisting against a grip she was told to stay still in. I've done nothing to this child in 30 years that I wouldn't do in front of God and her own father." The last word had barely left him when Reeve saw the change in Crane's face, not from anything the guard did, but from something behind Reeve. Crane was looking past him, over his shoulder, toward the long gallery, and the colour was going out of him. Reeve did not turn. He didn't need to. He had counted the minutes, and he knew, to the second, whose measured footsteps had been coming up the gallery for the length of that speech, and how far down that gallery a man would have to be to have heard every word of it. "You held her arm," Reeve said quietly, still not turning, his eyes on Crane's whitening face. "This morning, because she reached for a book, and if there's a mark on a 9-year-old's arm, it's because she put it there herself. Crane's mouth worked. His eyes were fixed on the gallery now, wide. "That is not. You've twisted. I was speaking generally. You weren't speaking generally, Doctor." Reeve's voice never lifted. "You were very specific," and a new voice came from the mouth of the gallery, low and level, and colder than anything Reeve had ever heard from it in 12 years of standing near it. "No," said Prince William, "he was." Dr. Alistair Crane turned all the way around, and for the first time in 30 years, the corridor was not waiting for him. Prince William stood at the mouth of the gallery where he had stopped some time ago, long enough ago that the question of how much he had heard did not need asking. He was not shouting, he was not moving, he had the terrible stillness of a man holding something in place by main force, and when he came down the corridor toward them, he came slowly, one unhurried step after another, and every step landed like a door closing. "Your Royal Highness." Crane found his voice and reached, on pure reflex, for the tone that had never once failed him, warm, senior, faintly amused at the whole misunderstanding. "I'm glad you're here. The sergeant has gotten hold of the wrong end of a very ordinary—" "Stop talking," William said. He said it quietly. Crane stopped. William's eyes went past him to the small shape behind Reeve. His daughter had come half out from behind the guard now, one hand still fisted in the scarlet wool, watching her father with an expression Reeve would not forget. Hope and terror braided so tight they were the same thing. The face of a child who had been told, and had come to believe, that the one person she most needed to be believed by would take the other man's side. "Charlotte," William said. The cold went out of his voice for her. It went somewhere else, held in reserve. "Show me your arm, sweetheart. Only if you can." She looked up at Reeve. Reeve gave her the smallest nod. "It's all right. I've got the corridor." And only then did she step out and draw back her sleeve and hold the arm up for her father to see. William looked at it for a long moment. He did not touch it. Reeve watched him take in exactly what the guard had taken in 20 minutes earlier, the line of it, the grip of it, the old yellow under the new red, and he watched a father understand it and a prince decide, in the same breath, that he would not come apart in front of his frightened daughter. "Thank you for showing me," William said gently. "That was very brave. None of this is your fault. Do you understand me? None of it." He waited until she nodded. "You're finished with lessons for today. You've been braver than anyone." Then he straightened and turned, and the cold came back all the way. Dr. Crane, 2 security officers had appeared at the far ends of the junction. No rush, no drawn hands, simply present, the way they had arrived in the reference the whole palace ran on. "You will not speak to my daughter. You will not go near her. You are done in this house, as of this moment, permanently." Sir, if I could just... Crane's composure was coming apart in real time, the 30 years peeling off him strip by strip. You have known me for most of your life. You would take the word of a guard and an overwrought child over a man who has served this. I took your word, William said. You gave it yourself. I heard every syllable of it from the gallery. You held a 9-year-old's arm hard enough to mark her, and you stood in this corridor and called it discipline. His voice did not rise, and that was the most frightening thing about it. There is nothing you can say that I have not already heard you say. Crane looked once at Reeve, and whatever he'd meant to put in that look, contempt or appeal, it found nothing to land on. Reeve simply held his post, immovable, the piece of the architecture that had turned out to be the load-bearing wall. The security officers stepped in on either side of Crane. There was no drama in it. One hand at each elbow, not forceful, only final. Crane's mouth opened and closed, and then, because there was genuinely nothing left, he let himself be walked. Down the long gallery, away, out of 30 years of belonging, in the complete and total silence of a man whose reputation had, at last, run out of people to convince. No one spoke until the sound of him was gone. The corridor emptied the way these things did when they were done properly. Not in chaos, but in order. An aide arrived from somewhere and was given quiet instructions. The Duchess was sent for. Charlotte was gathered up gently by her father, who crouched to her at last, now that the man was gone, and murmured something against her hair that Reeve didn't try to hear, because some things weren't his to hold. Before William led her away, Charlotte stopped. She looked back over her father's arm at the guard who had stood between her and the whole weight of 30 years. And she didn't say thank you, because she was 9 and the word was too small and she seemed to know it. She just looked at him. And Reeve, who had not let his face move in an hour, gave her the smallest thing he had. A single nod, soldier to soldier, one person who had held a line to another. Then she was gone, her hand in her father's, down the gallery and around the corner, and the light came slanting gold through the tall windows, exactly as it had that morning, and the clock 2 rooms over went on ticking with the patience of something that had counted a great many afternoons and would count a great many more. And Sergeant Callum Reeve was alone in the corridor. He stood for a moment longer at his post, because the post was the post, and no one had relieved him of it. Then something in his chest, some brace he had been holding rigid since a small pair of feet had come careful and frightened down that corridor, simply gave way. He didn't decide to move. His body decided. One knee went down to the cold stone, and then the other, and the immovable man, the piece of the architecture, the load-bearing wall, knelt in the empty corridor with his gloved hands braced on his thighs and his head bowed, and the breath went out of him all at once, in a way it hadn't gone in 12 years. It wasn't grief. It wasn't quite relief either, though relief was in it. It was the particular exhaustion of a man who had, 20 minutes ago, gambled everything he was on a reed of a child's arm and a memory of a corridor timetable, who had stood there with his whole career held out over the edge and no way to know until William's voice came down the gallery, whether he'd been right or whether he'd just ended himself for nothing. He had been right, and the being right had a cost that only landed now, in the quiet, with no one left to be steady for. His shoulders shook, his eyes stung and then spilled, and he let them, because there was no one to see and because he had earned the 2 minutes it would take. He thought of every channel he could have reported it through and how each one led back to Crane. He thought of how close it had come to going the other way, the dramatic child, the devoted tutor, the truth made smaller and smaller until it disappeared. He thought of a 9-year-old who had been taught that her word was worth nothing and who had just watched her word bring a giant down. Then he wiped his face with the back of a glove and he breathed and he got up off the stone. He squared the tunic, he set the bearskin level, he planted his boots on the seam where the runner met the stone, and he stood his post, the same quiet, the same gold light. But the corridor was not the same, and it never would be again. So here's what we keep coming back to. Sergeant Reeve had a dozen ways to report what he found that afternoon, and every single one of them ran straight back to the man who'd done it. He knew that. And instead of trusting the chain of command he'd built his whole life on, he gambled everything, his rank, his record, 12 years of service, on holding one corridor long enough for the truth to be heard by the one person who couldn't be talked around. If he'd been wrong, he'd have ended his career for nothing. So tell us, was he right to go around the system when the system was exactly what would have buried her? Or should a soldier trust the chain of command no matter what, and report it the correct way? And if you'd been standing in that corridor, holding a frightened child behind you, knowing what a name like Crane's could do to the truth, would you have had the nerve to do what he did? Drop your answer in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching from. If this one got to you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so the next story finds you. And share it with someone who believes the quiet ones are the ones worth watching. Then come back tomorrow, same time, for the next Royal Guard story. Because the next corridor has its own secret, and it starts with a door that should have stayed locked.